I understood that Crutzen and I were two children who had to climb out of the enclosure of the devastated city in order to discover both the natural environment and the blunt actuality of contemporary white American identity. From the evidence of his art, Crutzen encountered this new world in a flash of recognition, but also with the eye of a permanently alienated observer. This is the world that he has chosen to show you in his pictures. Crutzen and I come from precisely the same place in more than one sense. Let me explain. First, Crutzen and I both come from the 1970s in Brooklyn. New York City was, at this time, a city in economic freefall, an empire city that had become a kind of ruin of its former greatness. Difficult as it may be to imagine now, this was at the time a city that had been largely abandoned by the authorities and by the white middle class, to the so-called underclass and to the self-exiling, the artists, the sexual and political exiles. Because Crutzen and I were both immersed in the street life of this glamorously dystopian city, we responded by becoming feral children of the city, punk rock children, trying to assemble a voice from the scraps of nihilism, trash, and the leftover secondhand gestures of rock and roll. When I wrote about Gregory Crutzen the first time, I wrote from inside a series of recognitions. I understood that Crutzen and I were two children who had to climb out of the enclosure of the devastated city in order to discover both the natural environment and the blunt actuality of contemporary white American identity. These things were within us and shaped us, yet remained disguised by the glamorous chaos and juxtaposition of New York City at that time. Crutzen and I were plunged into these brutal and marvelous discoveries in the same way, by being driven in our family's car up into the small towns and woods of New England, Connecticut, Vermont, Massachusetts, Maine. From the evidence of his art, Crutzen encountered this new world in a flash of recognition, but also with the eye of a permanently alienated observer. This is the world that he has chosen to show you in his pictures. When I wrote what I wrote about Gregory Crutzen the first time, I wrote about how it aroused the artist's fundamental nightmare of solipsism, and how this was itself an involuntary confrontation with the terror of isolation and death. Crutzen's art slowly and painstakingly makes its way back to the intimate horizon of the personal, the body, the family, the community, and the individual psyche, admitting its humble dependence on those grounding realities and contexts. I believe that the radical implication of Crutzen's attention to this intimate horizon is that it contains a permanent grain of political utopianism. It is the same implication discovered by the surrealists within the procedure they called defamiliarization. Under Crutzen's gaze, we risk a glorious admission of our ignorance of the basic matter of our own lives. We are also startled by the promise of replenishment in a second encounter. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you so much. I'm going to listen carefully and see if there are questions for me.
Guardando la mostra di Gregory Crutzen e conoscendo abbastanza bene il suo lavoro, c'è questo fortissimo legame con la cultura indie rock. Penso a Io la tengo, o Ian Tweedy dei Wilco, o James Murphy degli LCD Sound System. Allora volevo sapere, lei quando scrive i suoi romanzi che cosa ascolta? Lo stesso tipo di indie rock oppure qualcosa di un po' più ambient?
Sometimes I have a playlist of very verbal rock songs that are memory talismans for me, that are very important. And so I do listen to bands like the ones you mentioned. When I was writing Chronic City, I listened to a lot of Yo La Tengo. LCD Sound System was part of my soundtrack when I worked on a book called The Blot, or A Gambler's Anatomy. I'm not sure what it was called in Italian. But, and of course, when I've written about New York City in the 70s, and I'm trying to reconstruct lost realities, lost memory palaces, I listen to a lot of music from that time, especially street music, the pop records, and the early hip-hop that was playing when I walked out of my house. You mentioned ambient music, and of course it's much easier to write on the whole to music without lyrics, and so I have a lot of playlists of music for just inducing a good memory state and a good ambient vibration for writing my work, and the only certainty is that I always have something playing. I don't like to write to silence. Occasionally I'll write to a baseball game on the radio.
In reading your books and watching Gregory Crutzen photographs, I always have this feeling of dystopia. And I wanted to ask you if, in your opinion, creating dystopias is a way to escape reality, but sometimes we create dystopias now because our reality is so bad that it's ever difficult to create dystopias these times.
Yes, thank you. That's a wonderful question. This has become a crucial question for me personally. I really relate to what you're wondering about there. You know, I grew up, as I said, at a time when the world produced images of catastrophe and dystopia, but the expression of it in art was relatively marginalized. You know, what were regarded as kind of trashy television shows at the time, or embarrassing things like The Twilight Zone, or you know, read authors who at the time were marginalized, like Philip K. Dick, to confirm my instincts that we lived in a kind of a daydream that was really a dystopia. Because these writers and visionaries were so prescient, and their language has become accepted and embraced to such a degree because of their prescience, that now dystopia can be a kind of automatic gesture, and in some cases a very lazy one, a very self-congratulatory or nihilistic or fashionable gesture. And it may even be that the seductive narratives of dystopian worlds have become engulfed in corporate storytelling methodologies. I mean, when you look at certain kinds of Hollywood films now, they have managed to design dystopias that every teenage kid growing up in the United States is very comfortable and familiar with and takes for granted. So rarely are the same insights being generated. So thank you. That's a marvelous question. Okay, thank you all very much. Yeah.